That in this room in December of 1863, Lieutenant Edgar Newcomb of the 19th Massachusetts Infantry died. Many men died at Chatham, of course. In fact, 133 of them were buried in the yard after the battles here. But rarely do we know as much about one man and one man's death as we do Edgar Newcomb. He was a student from Boston. He enlisted in the 19th Massachusetts, one of the most famous regiments to come out of New England during the war. And during the Battle of Fredericksburg, arrived around Chatham on December 11th, and then that afternoon and into the next day crossed into Fredericksburg, where they camped in the streets. Now, while Edgar was in the streets of Fredericksburg, his younger brother, who was not yet in the Army, his younger brother came to visit him. Actually got permission to go into town to visit him, and the two of them took refuge in a house probably on Caroline Street in Fredericksburg, and they slept together that night, sharing a blanket, trying to keep warm on a very cold winter's night. The next day, on December 13th, 1863, Edgar's regiment was ordered to fall in and prepare to go to battle. And meanwhile, Charlie, his younger brother, left, recrossed the river, and took refuge in the camps here in Stafford County. Edgar's regiment, middle of the afternoon on that rather warm winter day in the 50s, started across what we now call the Bloody Plain. And while going across the Bloody Plain, the color bearer of the 19th Massachusetts fell, and Edgar picked up the flag. And no sooner did he pick up the flag of the 19th Massachusetts that he was struck in both legs with an artillery shell. He fell grievously wounded. He was carried off the field by friends and eventually brought back here to Chatham. He was brought upstairs, we know. He was treated and brought upstairs, but it was realized pretty early that his case was hopeless. Meanwhile, Charlie hadn't heard from his brother and started to look for him, and he found him here at Chatham. And Charlie, 17 years old, committed to spend all of his energies trying to nurse his brother back to health. He got some help from a woman named Clara Barton, who was also working here, became later very famous as the founder of the American Red Cross. But Clara Barton and Charlie Newcomb attended to Edgar in his final days. He was probably brought into this room, and the hemorrhaging in his legs eventually took his life. Clara Barton was with him when he died. In fact, she wrote about it. She said he said, all of us were together with him repeating scriptures, and he, that is Edgar, saying to me pitifully before consciousness left him, "Please stay with me to the end," for Charlie never saw anyone die. When I rose from the side of the couch where I had knelt, this is Clara Barton writing, when I had rose from the side of the couch where I had knelt for hours until the last breath had faded, I wrung the blood from the bottom of my clothing before I could step for the weight around my feet. Dreadful days, dear sister. One's heart grows sick to think of it. Edgar's body was returned to Boston and buried there. Charlie returned to Chatham sometime in the 1870s, knocked on the door, and he was greeted by the owners here and asked if he could come inside. And he immediately rushed up the stairs and into what was probably this room. And the men who witnessed it recorded that he was able to find precisely the spot where Edgar Newcomb had lain, because the bloodstains of his brother were still visible on the floor here at Chatham. So a story like this is repeated hundreds of times over